Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome to the 5th session of our ImpactAbility Learning Series with our hosts Alan Mansky and Vicki Kamak. Today's session is entitled Who You Are is as Important as How. Alan and Vicki have invited their special guest, Ted Kuntz, who's the board chair of both Plan and Plan Institute, as well as an author and psychotherapist, to join them. This series focuses on the impactability of individuals in the disability movement. Alan and Vicki have discovered that people with disabilities and their families have a distinct talent for achieving impact, as they are continuously inventing and creating their way out of adversity. We hope that today's discussion will invite you to explore how your inner well-being affects your actions and behavior, and how inner peace can give rise to new relationships and lay the groundwork for systems change. I'm your webinar moderator today. My name is Tim Ames, and I'm the Executive Director of Plan and Plan Institute. I'm very proud of the teams that contribute so much to those who we support and partner with. Just to give you a bit of background, Plan Institute is a social enterprise whose main objectives are to improve the lives of people with disabilities by offering a suite of learning initiatives, advocating for policy reform, and collaborating on impact-based community projects. In fact, our focus on community impact led us to Tamarack Institute, who are one of the world's leading organizations around collective community impact, to be our key partner for this series. I feel very privileged to welcome and introduce Vicki Kamak and Alan Mansky to all of you. They are both recognized worldwide as social innovation leaders, as well as passionate contributors to the global family movement. They are co-founders of Plan and Plan Institute, and while both have been recognized with many awards, such as the Order of Canada, they both still consider themselves to be observers, students, and guides of social innovation, scale, impact, and sustainability. Good morning, Alan and Vicki. A warm welcome to you both. I want to thank you for leading the ImpactAbility series today and today's exciting session with Ted.
Thank you very much, Tim, and welcome everyone, wherever you may be listening from. It's so nice to have you all here with us. We're really looking forward to our chat. Today's guest, Ted Kuntz, and we'll introduce you to him very shortly. But first, we wanted to just share a few words about the pattern. Who you are is as important and may in fact be more important than how you do it. As many of you know, making the world a better place for people with disabilities and families can be harsh and unyielding work. If we're not careful, it can breed distrust, frustration, cynicism. It can cause us to lose faith in people, in ourselves, and in each other. It can infect our emotions, our spirit, our relationships. And if we're not careful, we can find our hearts closing rather than opening and turning into the very dragon we think we've been dealing with. The antidote to this is to pay attention to who you are. It's what has heart and meaning to you. In other words, your values, your highest aspirations. We invite you to just take a moment right now and think of a leader that you admire and describe them. Chances are you'll describe qualities of character and conviction, and not their strategies or the tools they use or the platforms that they have and devices they own. Individuals that you've met so far in this webinar series, as well as the individuals described in Al's book, Impact, are impressive collaborators, communicators, conveners, entrepreneurs, and strategists. They know how to get things done. But they are more than talented doers. There is one warm line that unites them. There is a peaceful and spiritual dimension to their lives. They pay attention to their blind spots, they've come to terms with their limitations, and they know what nourishes and replenishes them.
No one embodies this more than our guest today, Ted Kuntz. In fact, Ted is the inspiration behind this chapter. So today, I get a chance to publicly thank him. Ted has been a successful community activist for decades. He's won numerous awards stemming from his grassroots involvement, and to me that's the highest honor. Ted has has been mentioned at the beginning, is also a best-selling author, including Peace Begins With Me. Also, How Can I Wake Up When I Don't Know I'm Asleep? We're going to talk about that one, Ted. And also Making Peace with the Future, which he co-authored with Vicki. Ted, welcome.
Good morning, Hal. Good morning, Vicki. I've been looking forward to sharing this time with you and the kind of conversation that I know will unfold, and I'm excited to learn today too.
So Ted, I've got a two-part question for you because this pattern suggests that there are two parts to it. There's the who part and the how part. So I'm going to ask the who question. I think I'm beginning to sound like Dr. Seuss. I'm going to ask you the who question. And say that in the billing for this webinar, the Plan Institute folks use the tagline, improving oneself can improve the world. And so is there a relationship between who we are, one's inner spiritual life, and one's outer activist life? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I agree with you completely, Al. I think our way of being in the world actually speaks louder than what we do. That's what resonates with people. That's what touches people. And so we can be bright. We can have all the right ideas. But if our way of being is adversarial or judgmental or blaming or polarizing, we can undermine the good work by not being in the vibration of peace, of joy, of respect, of love, of compassion. You know, there's an expression that I like that says, "You're speaking so loudly, I can hardly hear you." And what I've learned is that the way we deliver the message is actually more important than the message.
Ted, are there, you know, is there an example that comes to mind, you know, either one personally or one that you've observed in our work together at Plan and Plan Institute, or more generally of this, either when it's working harmoniously or perhaps when it's broken and there's a difference between who we are and how we're expressing it?
Well, Al, I think actually you were a significant teacher for me in coming to this understanding. I remember you in your early activism work talking about being fueled by anger, and that anger, it's a fuel that burns us out. And I remember you talking about how you were able to shift your energy and your way of being so that you moved out of a place of anger or righteousness or that kind of warrior attitude where you took no prisoners. And I mean, your whole book, Impact, is about figuring out how to invite even our adversaries to the table and forming that relationship. So I would say, Al, you are the individual that has really modeled for me this journey of transforming oneself from being the warrior that can cause harm to the warrior that brings about change, but invites people to be with you on that journey. So I want to send it right back to you.
I'm not sure I'm an appropriate poster boy because it's a work in progress for me, Ted, but I appreciate the distinctions that you're making here, and I also appreciate the distinction you're making between, if you will, two types of warriors, and we'll follow up with that in subsequent questions, but I just want to get the how one out of the way. When I wrote that, you know, who you are, and I confess that I deliberated and went back and forth between who you are is as important or more important. And I've concluded, since I wrote it, that who you are is actually more important than how you do it. And the how I'm talking about are the means that we use to achieve our goals. That, you know, in our case, or in our audience's case, a better world for our sons and daughters, our family members, our friends with disabilities, and their parents. And sometimes, and I confess to being in this case, one falls in love with the means, with our cool strategy, or the way that we've one-upped somebody that we think is the enemy. And so I want, if you don't mind, I'd like you to reflect on that, on the how. You know, do the ends justify the means? And what happens when you haven't been clear, or haven't, you know, paid attention to your character, if you will, and let it inform how you act?
Yeah, I think the Dalai Lama has some kind of a quote, and I hope I give it justice, but it's something about when you overcome obstacles by force, you actually create another problem. I think that, you know, our work is how do we advance our social agenda? How do we bring about change? But we do it in such a way that we have people with us on that journey, that we haven't alienated and isolated large groups of people by our need to be right. I'm currently in Arizona, and I'm watching the polarization in the United States, which I think unfortunately is undermining this incredible country and the democracy that's here, because people are becoming polarized and insistent that their way is the right way, and there's a lack of openness to hear how others see the world, what's important to them. You know, in my work as a psychotherapist, I believe that we all are doing the best we can with what we know, that we all believe that our way is the right way. And I often say in working with couples is that all battles between in a couple relationship are between two people who both think they're right. And from their perspective, they are. And in honoring how others see the world, we open up space for them to also possibly honor how we see the world. But I think our work is around, in addition to advancing ideas, it's also modeling a way of being in dialogue that opens up the space for the conversations to be had and for us to evolve together as a community.
So Ted, just maybe to reflect on your comment here, and to move it back into this, the challenge of impact, is that for those of us who seek some profound changes, you know, in the world, my observation would be that it's possible to drive straight ahead with our strategy and tactics, and actually, in quotation marks, to win an issue in the short term. But we do it in a way that the win, the achievement, whether it's a new policy, a shift in regulation, a new fund, a law, that, in my observation, often those achievements become orphans. They become isolated and eventually erode, because the people in the system that we've forced to change actually haven't really changed their minds and their opinion, and so it becomes a standoff. And so in the long term, we don't get as much impact as we would have liked. And so there's a real practical reason for paying attention to this, isn't there?
Well, and I think you talked about this in your book, Impact, around your work around advancing the idea of the representation agreement. And it was a brilliant insight. It advanced that social agenda of inviting others to participate in and having legal status of decision-making for along with people with disabilities. But because I think you admit that you did it in spite of the concerns of the legal profession, that even though you were able to bring about that significant change, you didn't bring, they wouldn't join you in that change, and unfortunately then, as a result, they can undermine the good work that has been done. I've learned that if we create a win-lose situation, whoever loses in that exchange will undermine the good work, and so we have to figure out how to both win. We have to figure out how to honor the concerns of the other side and to be heard. And sometimes in our efforts to be right and to reach our goal, we can run roughshod over our fellow citizens in a way that actually makes the path more difficult, and we lose the goal because of the struggle.
Ted, we want to just take a few moments to dive a little deeper into your thinking in the book, Peace Begins With Me. For our listeners, if you're not familiar with this book, it is a treasured and dog-eared item in many library collections and doctor's offices, and you'll find it in a lot of surprising places where people have read and clearly been inspired and moved by what's within this idea of peace begins with me. Can you describe for us, Ted, when you chose that title, and it's such a strong title, and what does it mean? Like in simple, clear terms, what does peace begin with me?
Well,
go for it.
Yeah. It really emerged out of my own journey of making peace with my son's disabilities. Josh was injured by a vaccine shot at 5 months of age and developed an uncontrolled seizure disorder, which has resulted in him requiring 24-hour lifelong care. And when all of this first happened and Josh's abilities began to literally evaporate in front of my eyes, I became angry and resentful and afraid and in despair. And I have to admit that I was locked in that darkness probably for 3 or 4 years. And every day was a struggle because I was so angry with what had happened, and it shouldn't have happened. And then I had this beautiful exchange with Josh one day, and it's a longer story, but the short of it is that he was looking at me through the window after I came home from work and got out of the car, and I heard this beautiful question in my head that said, when your son looks through the glass at you, what does he see? And when I thought about what he saw, what I realized was he saw a father who was angry. He saw a father who was afraid, a father who was in resentment, a father who was in despair. And I realized that that dark emotion was just eating me up, and it got in my way of actually addressing in a responsible way the challenges that I was facing as a father, as a community citizen, as a husband. And it was that very day that I made a commitment to Josh, and I said, Josh, I'm going to learn how to make peace with this. I'm going to learn how to find my joy and my happiness again. And I'm going to learn how to fall in love with the son that I have, not the son that I don't have. And that was really the beginning of a journey of personal transformation for me, as a way of figuring out how to face the adversity that was in front of me in a much more constructive and creative way. And it has changed me. I feel like I have become an agent of change in my community, that I've been a source of inspiration, and it's because I found a way, I believe, to personally transmute the hurt and the anger and the disappointment and the fear into fuel that would say, how can I advance this human condition? How can I make a difference? So that's really where it came from, Vicki.
It's such a, really profound and moving story, Ted. And I think our listeners would be really interested to know a little bit more about the how. Like you talked about this transmutation of what many of us experiences in terms of our reactions to difficult and adversarial experiences. So how do we shift that? How do we find peace in the midst of what is sometimes despair and deep, deep challenges that we don't see a resolution to?
Well, at least for me, Vicki, it wasn't an easy transformation to make. What I realized is that I think, unfortunately, our society does a better job of teaching us how to be angry or afraid than it does at teaching us how to be peaceful and joyful and happy. So I really had to discover it through, essentially through trial and error. But I would say what was essential to the transformation was first of all, was the intention to say, this is who I want to be. This is the way of being that I want to have in the world. And I began to focus more on my way of being than on my doing. And one of the simple things that I did is, I observed that many of us make to-do lists every day about the things that we intend to accomplish. And I began to change that to a to-be list. Who do I want to be today? And literally at the end of my day, I would review my day and I would observe where I gave away my peace, my joy, my happiness, where I allow fear or despair or anger to consume me. And I would look for ways that I could overcome that or hold my joy a little bit longer. And so it was intention, it was observation, it was experimentation, it was reflection that I would say allowed me to move through to reach the goal of being a more peaceful person.
Your book has many really practical and useful suggestions, and just as you just shared now, the idea of even just a daily reflection of really how do I want to be today, the intention, and then the reflection on how has it gone. I'm wondering, it's today, it's a few years later since you originally wrote Peace Begins With Me. It's had a lot of, touched a lot of people. I'm curious if you would change anything in the book today, or if there's something that you wish you had included that didn't make it in there.
I'm pretty happy with what was revealed in Peace Begins With Me. But I would say that when I think back to my journey, one of the insights that I think that I've acquired since I wrote the book in 2005 is that when you're on this path, it's a path of leadership, and I believe that all of us have a responsibility to lead. All of us have a responsibility to leadership. That it's not about looking to a few so-called elite people to make the world a better place. I believe that it's a personal responsibility that we all have. And I've also come to recognize that there are times that leadership is a very lonely place. When you're ahead of your peers, when you see things that they don't see, it takes fortitude and it takes persistence to stay on that path of leadership because it's not a popularity contest. It's about being focused on advancing a goal. It's following your inspiration, and sometimes you have to recognize that you may be ahead of others in that work, and that's exactly where it's at, and to simply honor that you're in a place that it is lonely. So I would say that that's one of the things that at times I have felt lonely in my work, and then I need to reach out and build relationships and build collaborators, because if you stay alone in it, you can't survive.
So Ted, you're making so many critical points here, and I won't attempt to summarize them all, but I'll pick up on a couple of things you just said at the end where, you know, contrary to popular belief, we're not in a leaderless society, that we're actually in a leaderful society. And I think that's what you're getting at by suggesting that we all step up. We always have, we always will, but perhaps now there's a vacancy. So it's even more important for us, you know, to step up. I confess that my stepping up, as you alluded to, has been fueled by anger, or I like to say I think I was born with a chip on my shoulder. But what I want to discuss with you for a little while is that, you know, we're not, in talking this way, we're not glossing over the reasons why people get angry, or why people despair, or indeed why cynicism sprouts in our mind, or in our actions, or in our deeds. It seems to me those are perfectly legitimate responses to some of the messiness that the world is in, or that we see people with disabilities and their families confronting. It's not all goodness and light, and so there are challenges, and there is unfairness, and there is injustice, and so we respond with anger. I guess the trick, I guess what you're saying is that while they may be legitimate responses, be careful. Don't get stuck there. So I just wonder what you think. It's, you know, you're not saying let's gloss over some of the messiness. In fact, I know you well enough that I think what you're really saying is to confront it, to dive into it. Could you talk a little bit more about that, and maybe give us some insights about that kind of immersion?
Al, I agree with you completely. Is that there is lots of injustice that's happening in the world. There are things that demand our changing them, and we often begin with that emotion of anger when we see what's happening, with the hurt that's being caused, with the injustices that are there, with the destruction. What I've learned, though, is that fuel of anger burns pretty hot, and then it can burn us out. We can't sustain ourselves on this journey if the only fuel that we have is anger. Equally, despair. There are times I admit that I'm in despair. You know, sometimes I flippantly say that if you're not depressed, you're not paying attention. There is, you know, this human condition is an evolving species, and sometimes I will just admit to myself that the human species is not very evolved, and I can be angry about that, and then as quickly as I can, I like to shift and say, it is what it is. And so my work is, how do I advance the human condition? How do I take a position? How do I inspire or create or help to transform this human condition to be kinder, gentler, and more compassionate, more just? To stay in that energy of anger or indignation, or to say it shouldn't be this way, to be in that state of resistance, I've learned is distracting and eventually wears us out. Go ahead, Vicki. Yeah.
I mean, doesn't that anger serve a purpose sometimes? So isn't it like a catalyst or a spark or an energy?
Absolutely.
That fuels sometimes our courage. It might, you know, lead us to action in some ways that we wouldn't take from a more, serene place.
I absolutely agree. Is that I'm not suggesting that anger isn't valuable and doesn't have its purpose, but I also have learned to recognize that it won't sustain us on this journey of social change, because the kind of changes that we're looking at are changes that aren't going to happen in days or weeks or months or maybe even years. They might be decades long in their work. I look at the work of Martin Luther King or Gandhi, or people that have brought about significant social change. They needed to persist over a long period of time. I often, in my work with clients, I say sometimes we're carvers in life, and sometimes we have the luxury of carving in soft cedar, and we get to see the results very quickly. And other times we're carving in granite, and we're hitting that rock 99 times, and nothing happens. And what we have to hold on to is that maybe the next time something will happen. But it's about how do we sustain ourselves on this long journey. And so the anger certainly activates us, and we need to honor that. But we can get lost in it as well, is what I've noticed. And if all that comes out of our hearts is anger, I've noticed that at some point people, they can't stand in that energy for very long. They begin to pull away from it because it hurts. And so
Yeah.
I try to find a fuel that will advance the social ideas, and to me it's about being inspirational. It's about being loving. It's about modeling perseverance and openness and courage.
For sure, Al and I, over the years, we've come in contact with thousands of families, and certainly amongst them we've met folks who we really have had this sense that their anger is going to literally burn them out. I'm wondering, what are some suggestions? What do we do? What can we do to balance that? What can we do to touch the places in ourselves that will balance the anger and, as you say, sustain us for the long journey ahead?
I would suggest it's more about transforming the anger. And so what I've noticed for me is that anger often occurs when I have the idea that I'm powerless and that there's a situation that I can't do anything about. And when that happens, I move to a place of anger or blame. What I've tried to do is I try to step away from that thought of being powerless and embrace the power that I have, or look for ways that I can exercise power. And by power, I don't mean power over, which is often the way it's demonstrated in our world. I'm talking about power with, or the power of ideas. To me, I look at, for me, a role model is someone like Martin Luther King. And the social change that he brought about wasn't by force, it wasn't military force, it wasn't beating people up. It was the power of a dream. What do we remember about Martin Luther King? That beautiful speech of "I have a dream." And so I try to transform my anger and my blame into taking ownership of it. There's I'm sure you're familiar with Dr. Len, the Hawaiian psychologist who practices that Hawaiian form of forgiveness. I won't say the word properly, but it's Ho'oponopono or something like that, where a core element of that is saying, how have I created this very condition that we have, and what can I do about it? And so I've just learned that when we take ownership of the challenges, when we then become part of the solution. But there's a saying that says you can't become part of the solution if you don't admit that you're part of the problem. So I try to step into a place of ownership and taking responsibility for being the agent of change. And I've learned that that moves me out of my anger, and it moves me into a place of what I would say is a creative energy.
You reminded me, Ted, of an expression I sometimes use to describe my own journey. I think I mentioned earlier that I was born with a chip on my shoulder, and I tried to use it to good advantage over decades. I've now discovered that chips on shoulders make good compost, and so they can grow something much more similar to what you're describing when you talk about this conversion of our anger and our despair and our cynicism. Ted, we're getting a number of questions from the folks who are listening, and I want to preface one of the questions by saying that you were the original host for a retreat for caregivers offered by the Plan Institute, and one of the questions that has come forward is from an individual who is a caregiver for two adults, one who has a seizure disorder and the other is a survivor of a stroke, and he or she is observing that they've lost joy, and they don't know how to find it. They're not sad, just that life is joyless. And I'm wondering if you could respond to that, perhaps in the context of the reasons behind the Caregiver Retreat, and some of the spiritual practices or activities that you found folks using or that you might recommend.
Yeah, the Caregivers Retreat has been a beautiful experience. We've held it at a retreat center on Bowen Island, and I guess what I've most appreciated about it is the richness of the people that have come to participate. And we've had people that are new on this journey of having a loved one with a disability, and they're still often lost in their grief and their anger and their pain. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have these beautiful, wise souls who have whose lives have been transformed. They've become richer because of the struggle. And they have found ways to, as I say in my journey with Josh, I had to figure out how to fall in love with the son that I have, not the son that I don't have. I had to figure out how to fall in love with the life that I have, not the life I didn't have. To me, there's a spiritual journey, and the losses that we incur in having a loved one with a disability really are powerful forces that I've learned that the only way to overcome them is in some ways we have to figure out how to make peace with the disability. We have to make peace with the loss. We have to find a way to be in the struggle and honor the struggle. It's not easy work, but what the Caregiver Retreat did is offered an opportunity to witness people at various stages along the journey, and there's no judgment about where someone's at. It's simply honoring that this is a difficult journey, but it also gave hope that we can move through it. Now, I'll never have the life that I thought I would have by having a healthy child, but the life that I have had instead has been richer and deeper, and I would say more meaningful than I could ever have imagined. But it did require learning all kinds of lessons. It's about acceptance, forgiveness, humility, courage that I may not have learned before. And so you know, when I work with people in my counseling practice, I often invite them to say, what gifts might you have or might you acquire from this struggle? And in the beginning, they often dismiss the question because all they can see is the struggle and the loss. But I've learned that over time, they begin to recognize that there's a transformation that occurs through our suffering. Sometimes I say suffering is the gateway to wisdom. And so it's about opening up to how can we use this life experience for a greater good.
We're getting a number of questions, Ted, just really around focusing lots on the how. And I know that certainly at the retreat and in your book, there's a lot of really practical and concrete suggestions for people. I guess I was thinking, you know, certainly in my own life, you know, one of the ways that I can touch that place of groundedness, of peace, of connection is through my yoga practice. You've referenced journaling. I'm wondering if there are other things that you suggest for folks who are really, you know, some of those first steps on the journey. Like, really, how do we regularly connect with those points of peace within ourselves that allow us then to communicate with others, to share our message, to affect change in the world from a very different place?
Yeah. For me, it was about one is to look for some mentors, look for some role models, look for people that I witness had gone through some kind of deep suffering and were able to transcend the suffering. And so, and they can be people in our own intimate lives, but it could be, you know, like I said, looking at somebody like Martin Luther King, who took on a huge task of changing the civil rights movement in the United States and overcoming the challenges that the black people face in America. And the work is not done, but his way of being on that journey was an inspiration to me. I like the words of Gandhi, who talks about being the change that you want to see in the world. I guess for me it was around, first of all, saying I actually am responsible for my thoughts, my feelings, and my behaviors. And so it's claiming ownership of that as opposed to acting powerless or acting like a victim. And then the other simple tools that I figured out were things like, what's my intention? I believe that when we live life from an intention, that the path begins to unfold and resources come to support us, but our job is to set the intention. And for me, it was the intention to live life with joy, with peace, with happiness, and to help to make the world a better place, and to take my responsibility for being part of that as an agent of change. Another tool was what I call the power of attention. It's about what do I look at? I can open up those newspapers every day and see loss to be in despair about, but I can also walk down the street and witness beautiful acts of neighborliness, of love between a parent and a child, of people caring for this planet. And so, one of the stories in my book that I share is the story of the two wolves, about which wolf will I feed. And so I've made an intention to focus my attention on the good things in the world. So those are a couple of kind of tools in the toolbox that began to transform my way of being in this world.
Those are super, super helpful and practical as well, Ted. I'm wondering, what's clear underneath these tools, if you will, that you described in your toolbox is there's got to be a kind of discipline to maintain it, to continue to feed that hold the intention and believe in it. What is it that sustained you over time? What is it that's really helped you maintain that discipline?
I guess, you know, my life it feels richer and more constructive when I'm holding that vibration of joy, peace, acceptance, forgiveness. You know, there's a fellow by the name of David Hawkins who's written a book called Power versus Force, and just the title of the book was very helpful to me because he makes the distinction between power, genuine power, and force. And he says lots of what we witness in the world today is actually force, not power. And then he talks about role models of power, people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King. But he also, one of the other contributions he makes in the book is that he believes that every thought and every emotion has a particular vibration, that we're actually vibrational beings. And he's created what he calls a map of consciousness, where he maps out emotions and thoughts on a scale between 0 and 1,000. And emotions like anger and fear and shame and guilt and blame are all low vibration. You know, they're 50, 70, 100, 125 on his scale. And David suggests that any vibration below 200 is actually destructive. And he invites you to hold a vibration above the 200, and above 200 is acceptance, forgiveness, peace, joy, love, honoring, celebrating, gratitude. And I just learned that when I intentionally hold a higher vibration, that there's this ease and this grace that starts to happen. I've learned that people are instinctively drawn to that vibration. They want to be in that energy. And so in some ways it becomes a feedback system that says this allows life to actually be more graceful, but also more powerful in the genuine sense of power. So I think when I began to take ownership of my thoughts and my feelings and hold that space on a more consistent basis, the feedback was, this is working. And I guess that's what kept me going.
So Ted, by sheer coincidence today, a daily thought arrived from Jean Vanier. For our listeners from outside of Canada, you may not be as familiar that Jean is J-E-A-N, Vanier, the founder of the L'Arche movement. L'Arche is in the Ark. And I subscribe to this, and this is one of my morning disciplines, is to think about what Jean has to say. These are excerpts from his many books. This one says, finding new ways. We can try new ways to find peace of heart and a little tranquility by doing simple, practical things. Cooking, cleaning the house, visiting a friend, writing a letter, taking a walk, listening to gentle music, visiting a church, praying in silence, playing with children. In the midst of all of our weaknesses and pain, we can experience moments of peace and joy. And then, so that's, I invite listeners to subscribe to those daily thoughts from Jean Vanier. But then, lo and behold, this comment arrives from one of our listeners, and he or she says, in thinking about the practice of finding peace and joy, a key pattern to trying to find ways to get to them often denotes taking a solitary approach. For example, for this individual, it's writing in her journal, being aware of his intentions and thoughts. And then she or he concludes, in this day of social media and the constant threat of isolation, vulnerabilities are kept to our private selves. And this may be a group of people who are listening, and so they're wondering if the opening up to vulnerability and to community can be just as potent and helpful for one's personal journey to peace. What are your thoughts on either or both of those?
Well, I think there are many paths to peace. One of the, I like the idea of the reflection. I think that's one of the things that I learned from you and Vicki, as you talked about, particularly you shared this at an organizational level, that organizations are often funded for their doing, but there's no space to actually, or there's not funding to actually allow organizations simply to pause and reflect. And I think that that's important on an organizational level. It's also really important on a personal level that we allow some space just to notice where we're at and reflect upon, are we moving in the right direction? Are we feeding the wolf that we want to feed? Are we living a rich and meaningful life? I also believe it's important to have a community of people around us who will invite us into those kinds of discussions or reflections. And so a meditation group, a faith community, or a spiritual community. And to me, it's not so much about what, I'm not interested in the dogma of it. I'm interested in the practice of stillness, the practice of presence. I think that we live in a world that we allow too much of the external world to occupy us. And I believe that the wisdom that we have is actually in us, and in order to access it, we have to move to a place of stillness to allow that voice and that information to emerge. And to me, there isn't enough of that opportunity in our busy lives to create an openness or a space for the wisdom to emerge.
You're reminding me, Ted, of a tradition that you started at our board meeting, and that was to begin every meeting with a reflection that somebody, a member of the board or a member of staff, brought that we could all think about, and or a story about the work we're doing that had inspired that individual that he or she wanted to share. And so I want to thank you for that. I don't go to planned board meetings anymore, but I hope that tradition still continues, because I think it's, oh, good. I think, Ted, this is a good place to end and to pass it back to Tim, and that is that we're not in this alone. We're in this together. And the vitality of the family movement is that we can make peace with each other and be peaceful together. So I appreciate you underlining that point for us, at our board meetings and staff meetings, but also as a way to conclude this conversation. So I want to thank you on behalf of Vicki and I, but also pass it back to Tim, who may have some concluding thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Al, Vicki, and Ted. Pretty amazing session this morning with rich insights, learning, and perspectives for all of us. We are almost time to bring the webinar to a close. But I just kind of had one interesting thought. Al, you talked about the chip on your shoulder and the force and the anger driving you in the early days of your work. Was there a moment, or can you maybe talk about the journey that it's taken for you to be maybe a little bit softer or more reflective, or what brought about the change for you, and how did you direct the anger somewhere else?
Well, that's probably a longer story over a bottle of pop or a glass of whiskey. Finding somebody to love and who loved me deeply was the beginning of converting that. So the ability of Vicki and I to not only work together but to be in love and still be in love was was the starting point. But I'm sure Vicki would observe that those journeys are never over, and I'm still dealing with that. It's just, as Ted has pointed out, it's just out in the open now.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And maybe just kind of one other thought, and maybe this is one for Vicky or both of you. What's the fuel that consistently drives you both forward now in the work that you're doing?
Well, you know, we have a mutual friend called Jacques Dufresne who was described something called your moral oxygen, and I think that really is a fuel. It's a fuel that it really touches the deepest places in ourselves, that creates the opportunity both to have a vision about what you want in the world, but also is it really is, it's like the air you breathe. It tells you how to be in the world. And so some of the parts of that fuel I mentioned earlier, things like yoga, the silence that Ted referenced, the opportunity to reflect, the gentle moments, to pause, to celebrate the good, to feed that good wolf. All of those are really what is are the ingredients of the moral oxygen, if you will.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Vicki. You know, this webinar series would not have been possible without the support of some really amazing partners who we'll just bring up on your screen now. These partners, along with the teams at Plan and Plan Institute and Tamarack Institute, are making an impact every day, both for communities and individuals across Canada and beyond. We'd like to invite you and look forward to your presence at the next webinar, which will be on Tuesday, January 24th at 9 a.m. Pacific Time or 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. The pattern for the next discussion, which is truly appropriate, will be Advocate with Empathy, with special guest Donna Thompson. We'd like to remind you that you'll need to register for each of these webinars individually. If you've not already done so, please go online and register at the link that is on your screen right now. We have lots more exciting events and resources available. Please visit our website at planinstitute.ca or rdsp.com to learn more and sign up for our monthly email-based newsletter. As well as, please check out our partner Tamarack Institute's website. They organize and host many community building programs and workshops across Canada. As a reminder, later this week we'll be sending you an email with links to the audio and other materials related to today's webinar, including a discount code to purchase your own copy of Impact. We welcome your feedback, so please do email us and let us know how we're doing. And last, certainly not least, as we bring this session to a close, we'd like to thank everyone for joining us on this webinar. Your comments and questions helped us to make this a dynamic and thought-provoking conversation today. Till we meet next time, we wish you well.